Hello, you're watching the business interview here on France 24. I'm Tom Burgess-Watson, and my guest today is a one-time Olympic fencer, an accomplished cellist, and a former Australian Air Force officer. He had a distinguished career in business and finance, and he was, for a decade, the president of the World Bank, and perhaps one of the bank's most influential presidents at that, serving 2 terms. James Wolfenson, thank you very much indeed for coming here to talk to us at France 24.
Thank you, Tom.
Now, during your 10 years as president of the World Bank, you're credited with really putting back to the top of the agenda the institution's real goal, which is fighting poverty around the world. Now, 6 years since you left your post, are you satisfied that your efforts are still bearing fruit?
Well, I think that it's a huge mandate, and I think that my successors, particularly the successor who's there now, has spent a huge amount of time and effort trying to broaden what I was doing, but always with the central objective of dealing with the people that live in poverty and trying to make it a better life for them. Of course, you know that there are several billion people in the world who live in a form of poverty. So it's an enormous challenge, but I have no doubt that the World Bank has a central focus on it.
Now, corruption, debt relief, the environment, gender equality, these are all things that were very close to you and your mandate as president of the World Bank. But people, in particular, talking about corruption, people didn't like you talking about this when you first came into office. It was called the C word, corruption, a dirty word. Mm-hmm. But you went ahead and talked about it anyway, and with results.
Well, the reason that I think it wasn't fully welcomed is that quite a number of our shareholders represented countries that were corrupt. And so they were a little taken aback when, as a matter of central importance to the institution, I talked about the cancer of corruption. I was warned not to do it, but what was fascinating was that at the next meeting 6 months later, every director of the bank talked about corruption, how terrible it was. And so it wasn't that they were trying to defend it, indeed they were not, but they were certainly in some cases trying to conceal the corruption that existed.
So you put corruption under the spotlight once again.
Well, I did, and I'm very happy to say that in the years of my presidency, we did quite a lot to really ensure that our projects, insofar as we could control them, were protected to the maximum extent possible against corrupt activities.
Now, poverty reduction, of course, a major goal of yours, but rather depressing news out of the United States just this week. There are more Americans living below the poverty line than ever before. That must hit you in the heart,
Well, it hits me in the heart, but of course, it's not part of the mandate of the World Bank. The World Bank deals with the countries that are much less rich than the United States. It deals with the really a group of countries which are not part of the G20 or the G7, and where the greater number of people living in poverty are. And poverty in the developing world is living under $2.50 and living under $1.25 a day. And there are 1 billion people living under $1.25 a day. So that is very different from the definition of poverty in the United States. It doesn't mean that it's any easier to be poor in the United States, but the multiple is quite different.
And of course, you saw so much poverty firsthand, visiting about 120 countries during your
time. No, I had the privilege of doing that. And of course, you discover that the people who live in poverty have their own grandeur. They all care about their kids. They all want a better life. But many of them are never going to have that.
Now, today, the world is very different from how it was 6 years ago. That's not very much time, and yet the differences are huge. Here in Europe, we're in the grip of a crisis. The United States, there's talk of a double-dip recession. Where do you see things heading for the global economy?
Well, I think you have to make a distinction that has been appearing significantly in recent years. First of all, you're having a great move in terms of economic power to Asia, to China, to India, and to the Asian countries. After World War II, China and India were 1.5% of the world's GDP, or the world's income. Today, they're about 13, and by 2050, they'll be 50% of the world's GDP. So you have this enormous swing in terms of what is happening in Asia. And at the same time, you're showing serious weaknesses in Europe and in the United States. We're having much less employment, substantial unemployment, in fact, in both areas of the world. And as you well know, in terms of the European Union, the Union is being stressed by those countries that are not able to catch up or keep up, the most notable at the moment being Greece.
Now, you have a career as an international investment banker. You work with Schroders, you work with Salomon Brothers. Do you see it as in any way problematic, the fact that there's so much back and forth between people in the banking world, the executives, and people in the political world in terms of ever addressing any of the questions of regulation that so badly need addressing? There must be some conflicts of interest there.
Well, there are really no laws which permit over a group of countries a common approach to the issue of regulation. When they started to come together in the group of countries, they all agreed that they would only have a maximum of 3% of their GDP, 3% of their income of debt. That went out of the window years ago, and that was on an annual basis. And now we find in very many countries, one of which, of course, is Greece, that they've built up debts of 150% of their income. And it becomes very difficult then to put it right. And so you have now the challenge of getting the countries together without a legal right to do it. There is a voluntary agreement to be part of it, and I suppose either Greece will stay in that voluntary agreement, or, as some people suggest, it should be put out to regularize its debts.
And if Greece leaves the Eurozone, that's going to
If Greece leaves the Eurozone, it'll be very bad for Greece, but it will put great stresses on the rest of the Eurozone, even though there are those people who say if you just get rid of Greece, we'll be able to put a wall around all the rest of it. My own personal view is that it will create some difficulties, but these things are being tested at this very moment.
And there is talk that, in fact, it was a large international investment bank that helped Greece do its accounts to give it access to the Eurozone in the first place.
I don't think that it was any single bank that did it. I think it was something that happened over a period of years, and the Greek government allowed it to happen, and indeed the Greek people were not willing to take the sacrifices to put things straight.
Now, your sister organization, your ex-sister organization, the IMF, has had a change of leadership in recent months and is playing a key role now in really putting the Eurozone and the global economy at large back on track. Now, you were very much in favor of Gordon Brown taking over at the IMF, someone that you had worked with personally, and then it turns out that now Christine Lagarde, our former finance minister here in France, is at the reins. Do you think she's got what it takes?
I think there were some very good candidates, one of which was Gordon, the other was Christine. And indeed, I had the pleasure of staying in my house a few weeks ago in the west of the United States. And she is a formidable person, as I'm sure you know, very clear views. And within a very short time, as I'm sure is clear to the French public, she came out and made very strong statements about the need to strengthen the system. So I think she's already put a hand down of saying this is not something to play with by amateurs. This has to be dealt with in a very strong way, and I think she's made a very fine start.
And being a woman is interesting because she herself said that perhaps many of the problems that we have in the world today, certainly in the world of finance, have been caused by an excess of testosterone. I'm not sure if I'm exactly quoting her correctly, but the fact that she's a woman, do you think that that's of any significance at all?
Well, I think she'll have greater sensitivity on some issues. But I think the important thing is to have intellect and to have spine to be able to carry things through. And I think Christine has shown over her years as finance minister that she is a person to be reckoned with. So I think she's a very good candidate to be assuming this role.
I'd like to talk to you a little bit about your own personal life. You've mentioned previously that your own upbringing, which was not without its financial challenges, let's say. Did this fuel your drive and ambition and really propel you into the working world?
Well, I think at the beginning, if you have no money, it's a very good stimulus to be able to go and make some money. And I was aware of the fact that without resources, you were limited in what you could do. But the way to get resources was not to go and steal it. It was to try and put yourself in a professional situation where you could do two things. First of all, make resources for yourself and build it up over a period of time. But what was always a part of my approach was also to put yourself in a situation where you could give something back, where you could be a member of the community that was contributing. And I think I was fortunate to be able to build a life in which I could not only make a few dollars, but also could not only give a few dollars away, but serve the public as well.
Did you find it difficult to reconcile your own, by anybody's standards, immense fortune with the extreme poverty I presume you were seeing when you toured the world?
Well, I don't know about immense fortune. I made a certain amount of money, but I never found it difficult to draw the distinction. After all, I worked for 11 years without any money, without being paid, or being paid a modest amount as president of the World Bank. I think if you establish as a character of your life that the goal is not just to accumulate resources, but it is to be a contributing member of society in whatever it is you're doing, you have a much better life. It's much better for your kids. They share or learn these values. And it gives you an opportunity to bring balance to not only what you do, but to set standards for other people.
Very briefly, you've got a number of very interesting hobbies: fencing,
right,
playing the cello. How important do you think it is for a successful businessman to have other interests in parallel with his business life?
Well, I think it's an enormous advantage to be able to do some things outside the realm of business. I took up the cello at 42 years old, and I've given now 4 Carnegie Hall concerts. Mind you, they're with friends, and I was chairman of Carnegie Hall, so I can get the whole rather easily. But in terms of fencing and in terms of testing yourself, I think it's important to, in these days, where you're not limited by family, where you have an opportunity to do damn near anything, that setting yourself certain targets is useful not only as a discipline, but it's great fun.
That in itself gives us an awful lot to think about and some very important lessons there. Thank you very much indeed, James D. Wolfenson, former president of the World Bank. Thank you for coming to talk to us at France 24. Thanks to you for watching. More news coming up very shortly. Stay tuned.